Beekeeping has been a topic that most people know nothing about. How is it that these bees scatter themselves from flower to flower, collect nectar, and even produce honey? The golden honey that we know and love is made by these yellow and black fuzzy creatures, and I want to know more. Recently, huge waves of attention have been spent on spreading love for bees, on saving the bees. But how can we actually save them? And maybe we're part of the problem. Before getting my hands dirty, I wanted to know more about these beautiful creatures. In general, bees can be split into two categories, honeybees and native bees. Both are flower pollinators that live to drink nectar, create honey, and make brood, or perfect conditions for babies. As Brian Garreau and Sandra DiDonato mention in the Journal of Becoming Pollinators, many beekeepers raise honeybees as a hobby, and these are the most popular bees that can be purchased. They often buzz around looking for nectar and don't discriminate between plants. Next is our native bees. As Anne McCann emphasizes in the Planet Bee Foundation, native bee species are up to 3 times more efficient at pollinating their local surroundings than honeybees. This goes hand in hand with how native bees live. Often, they are specialized to a location and plants, and this shows up in their genetic makeup. From this brief depiction, a huge problem arises that I hadn't originally planned for. What if beekeeping is harming ecosystems and bees more than it's helping the population? From research, there are hundreds of conflicting views. These cute and otherwise harmless creatures may have a dark side, but humans could be to blame. My original question was to find whether honey harvesting affects bee populations, but I actually found that honeybees could be more dangerous. Before I get too far, let's talk about beekeeping. If you've ever seen the funny hats and nets, you should know that it doesn't reflect all beekeepers or the bees' behavior. When comfy, bees interact calmly with their environment, often being able to land on and move around without stinging. Beekeepers' role with these bees is to provide a home and food source for the bees, often using them to harvest their honey, beeswax, or increase population. One beekeeper from beehour.com even states how bees create a surplus of honey when they're active, and that overproduction should be harvested to prevent bee swarms or a decrease in brood cells formed. The most important thing that beekeepers around the globe have to remember is how to take care of their bees and keep them safe. For most beekeepers, their bees are precious and need a lot of care. One method that beekeepers use to keep their bees safe and harvest honey starts simple. First, a beekeeper burns leaves and natural material in a container and uses it to smoke out the bees. This calms them down before the beekeeper peeks into the hive frames to determine which cells are ready. After 80% of caps are filled, a frame is ready for harvest. Frames are placed into a bin and caps are broken and spun until honey spills into a filter and can be put into jars. This requires lots of labor and time, but can produce over 95 pounds of honey, at least for the fall line ridge from this video. Of these human interactions, bees don't appear to be harmed, and the beekeeping and honey harvesting process actually increases the bee population. That is, for honeybees. Beekeepers create perfect conditions for their bees, from temperature to humidity to sugar water and nectar, and they allow these bees to be likely to survive harsh winter conditions. As Fall Line Ridge also shows us, an experienced beekeeper knows how much honey to harvest to leave enough for bees to eat during colder winter months where honey can't be produced. So I determined that honey harvesting actually does benefit bee populations. The bigger issue was for the native guys. Pesticides and foreign bees are taking native bee resources, honey supply, they spread disease, and human pesticides are killing pollinators and honey. Blog post from Bee Hour's blog, the author states that chemically fertilized crops that produce nectar are affecting reproduction and survival rate. In addition, with a surplus of honeybees, competition arises between native and hobbyist bees to survive. A study was published in the Scientific American where bees were studied in the Canary Islands to see how honeybees affect native pollinating communities. And it was found that biodiversity vastly decreased after honeybees were introduced to the island, as pollen wasn't transported correctly and plants were left seedless. This meant that honeybees were taking nectar away from native populations and couldn't pollinate specific flowers that were only created for native bees to pollinate. But it isn't all bad. Beekeepers around the world bring attention to these practices and show how we can actually save the bees. They spread the word, which helps us make action. First, by planting or watering wildflowers that are food sources for all bees, there's a larger food supply. From this, they can make a surplus that can increase bee populations, and watering holes can be made in addition to flowers to give these bees a fighting chance to rest and drink or cool off, especially during the summer months. And with that, I answer my research question about how honeybee populations are really affected, even if it's different than how I originally thought.